The night Park Min-jun was supposed to die. It rained so hard the streets of Seoul looked like rivers running uphill. No warning, no last words, no dramatic final stand worthy of the man they called the Black Dragon, the most feared name in the Korean underground. A man whose silence alone had ended careers, ended alliances, ended lives. Just 4 black SUVs, a narrow road outside Mapo district, and 37 bullets. His security detail was dead before they could draw. His driver took 3 shots to the chest and still tried to accelerate. Min-jun himself caught 2 bullets, one through the shoulder, one that grazed his skull, before the car flipped into the guardrail and everything went black. They found him 3 hours later. Pulse so faint the paramedics argued about whether it was real. Brain activity so low, the senior doctor at Severance Hospital pulled the attending aside in the hallway and spoke in a voice that didn't leave room for hope. "Prepare the family," he said. "This is a formality at this point." The family was prepared. In fact, the family had been prepared before the ambulance even arrived. Park Soo-yeon, Min-jun's mother, received the call at 11:43 p.m. She was still dressed, still wearing her pearls. She set down her tea, listened, said "I understand," and hung up. Then she walked to the window of her Hanam-dong penthouse and looked out over the city her son had bled to build. And she felt nothing that looked like grief. What she felt was closer to relief. His uncle, Chairman Park Dae-hyun, arrived at the hospital at midnight, not to pray, but to assess. He walked the length of the ICU hallway with his hands behind his back, like a man surveying a property he was about to purchase, which, in every way that mattered, he was. Min-jun's empire, the shell companies, the port contracts, the underground syndicate that moved money through half of East Asia, was worth 42 billion won at conservative estimate. And with the Black Dragon lying brain dead in room 4C, the only thing standing between that fortune and the hands already reaching for it was a legal technicality and a little time. The doctors gave him 72 hours. His family gave him less. Nobody noticed Hana. That was, in many ways, her greatest skill and her oldest wound. She had worked in the Park mansion for 8 months by the time they brought Min-jun home from the hospital. 8 months of 5 a.m. mornings, of marble floors that needed polishing before the household woke, of learning which hallways to avoid when the chairman visited and which rooms to disappear from when Madame Park was in a particular mood. 8 months of being invisible in the way that only a young African woman in a Korean billionaire's household could be invisible, completely, deliberately, as if her presence was something the house tolerated rather than employed. Her full name was Hana Diallo, 27 years old, from a city that most people in this building couldn't place on a map. She had a quiet face that gave very little away, hands that were always busy, and eyes that noticed everything, the kind that seemed calm at first glance, until one noticed the quiet attentiveness within them. She had reasons for being here that she had never told anyone. She planned to keep it that way. She moved Min-jun the 4th day, when it became clear the hospital was only prolonging the obvious. A private medical team was installed, 2 nurses, a rotating physician, a ventilator that breathed for him in slow mechanical sighs. His room was sealed. His mother visited once, stood at the doorway without entering, and left after 40 seconds. The staff began the quiet, practiced business of pretending nothing was happening while preparing for everything to change. Furniture was quietly assessed. Artwork was casually discussed. His assistant of 6 years submitted a resignation letter before the week was out. One by one, the people who had built their lives around Park Min-jun began the dignified process of abandoning him. Hana started cooking him soup, not because anyone asked, not because it was her job. The medical team had their protocols, his nutrition was handled, and no instruction from Madame Park had extended to the kitchen staff doing anything beyond their assigned duties for a man everyone had quietly agreed was already gone. She did it because she had watched her own father waste away in a hospital bed once, and she had learned the hard way that the body could feel things the brain couldn't register: warmth, smell, the sound of someone nearby who refused to treat you like you were already dead. She began bringing a small bowl of pepper broth to his room each morning, setting it near enough that the steam rose toward him, sitting for 10 minutes, not speaking at first, just present. The nurses thought it was strange. They didn't stop her, Madam Park didn't know. By day 6, Hana was humming, soft and low, a song from home, something her grandmother had sung when the nights grew too heavy. Hana sat beside Minjun's bed, hands folded in her lap, humming gently. The machines continued their rhythm, breathing for him, while the soul rain tapped against the window. The room felt less like a place of despair than it had the day before. She didn't know if he could hear her. She chose to believe he could. "You have a very stubborn face," she told him on day 6 in English, because her Korean wasn't yet good enough for the things she wanted to say. "Even unconscious, you look like a man who refuses to be told what to do." She paused. "I understand that, more than you would think." She looked at him. At the strong jaw now slack, the sharp features softened by stillness. The hands that the household staff had whispered about in fearful tones lying open and still at his sides. "But this," she said quietly, "is not how your story ends." "I don't believe that." She wasn't sure she was saying it for him. Night 7 arrived the way catastrophes do, quietly, then all at once. The monitor spiked. The duty nurse ran in. The physician was called. Hana stood in the hallway outside his room, her arms wrapped around herself, listening to the controlled urgency of voices on the other side of a door that had been firmly closed in her face. She heard the words, "cardiac event." She heard numbers exchanged in tones that dropped lower the more serious they became. She heard silence, the particular silence of medical professionals pausing because the next step was a conversation nobody wanted to start. She pushed the door open. "Miss, you cannot be in here." "I'm not leaving," she said, not loudly, not with drama. Just a simple statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone who had already decided and was not available for further discussion. The nurse looked at the physician. The physician looked at Hana. Something in her face, the absolute stillness of it, the complete absence of hysteria, made him step back without quite knowing why. She walked to the bed. Outside, the rain had become something violent, the kind of storm that made Seoul feel temporary, made every lit window look fragile. Thunder moved through the building. The lights in the room flickered once. Hana sat on the edge of the bed. She took his hand, both of them, wrapping her fingers around his cold ones, and she leaned close, close enough that what she said next was not for the room, it was only for him. "You are not allowed to leave yet," she whispered. "Do you hear me? I did not stay in this house for 8 months and cook soup that no one asked me to cook and sit in this chair every morning just to watch you disappear." Her voice was steady, fierce with a quietness that was more powerful than volume. "You still owe the world something. I don't know what it is yet, but I know it is not finished, and you are not finished." She was still holding his hands when the monitor steadied. The physician stared at the screen. The nurse covered her mouth. Hana didn't look at either of them. She kept her eyes on Minjun's face, on the almost imperceptible change in it, the faintest tension returning to the muscles around his jaw, the shallow deepening of his breath. She stayed like that until morning. She was still there when his eyes opened, not dramatically, not the way it happened in the dramas she sometimes watched on her phone in the laundry room at midnight. His eyes opened the way a man wakes from a sleep so deep he isn't sure, for a moment, which world he's in. He stared at the ceiling, then, slowly, at the window, then at the woman sitting beside him holding his hands, watching him with an expression he couldn't read, relief and something more guarded, something she was already pulling back behind her eyes. His throat was raw. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a sound. "Why?" He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Why did you stay?" Hana looked at him for a long moment. Then she let go of his hands, stood, smoothed her uniform, and picked up the bowl of broth she had brought that morning, still warm because she had learned which corner of the room held heat the longest. "Drink this first," she said. "Questions later." And Park Min-jun, the Black Dragon, the most feared man in Seoul's underground, who had not taken an order from another human being in 11 years, opened his mouth and drank. Recovery, for a man like Park Min-jun, was its own kind of humiliation. He had built his reputation on being untouchable, on walking into rooms that rearranged themselves around his presence, on making decisions that moved money, moved people, moved entire power structures, with nothing more than a word and the expectation that the word would be enough. Now he couldn't sit up without his vision tilting. The physician restricted him to bed for the first week. His legs, unused for 9 days, felt borrowed. His hands, the same hands that had signed off on operations that made grown men lose sleep, trembled when he lifted a cup. He hated every second of it with a quiet, compressed fury that he had nowhere to put. Hana noticed. She said nothing about it. That somehow made it worse and better at the same time. She helped him get better like she always did things, simply and quietly. She gave him broth in the morning and reminded him to take his medicine, but not in a way that made him feel like a child. She opened the window at just the right time when the sun was coming in and closed it before it got too cold. She knew what he needed before he said anything and took care of it without him feeling like she was watching him. It unsettled him. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life reading people, their motivations, their angles, the thing they wanted that they were pretending not to want. It was how he had survived. It was how he had won. He could not read Hana Diallo. He asked his head of subconsciousness, he asked his head of security, a broad, quiet man named Kang, to pull up the household CCTV archive. 8 months of footage. He told Kang it was a security review. Kang didn't ask further questions. That was why Kang had lasted 6 years. Min-jun watched alone. He told himself he was looking for threats, gaps in the security rotation, anything that might explain how the ambush had been so precise, so surgical, how someone had known exactly which route his convoy would take that night. He watched the footage. And yes, he noted the gaps. He noted the patterns. His investigator's mind cataloged everything with the cold efficiency that had never fully switched off, even in a hospital bed. But he kept returning to one feed: kitchen camera, northeast corner, timestamp ranging across 8 months. Hana, at 5 a.m., moving through the kitchen before anyone else woke. Hana eating her own meals alone, always at the small table near the service entrance, always with a book propped open. Hana pausing sometimes, just for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, with an expression on her face that he recognized without being able to name, the look of someone carrying something heavy and long since accustomed to carrying it alone. He watched her bring soup to his room on day 4 of his coma, day 5, day 6. He watched her sit, he watched her hum. He couldn't hear it on the footage, but he could see it, the slight movement in her throat, the way her shoulders dropped into it. He watched night 7, he watched her push through the door, he watched himself, his own still body. And then he watched her sit on the edge of the bed and take his hands and lean forward and say something the camera couldn't capture. He watched his own monitors stabilize. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She stopped in the hallway. Upright, which he wasn't supposed to be yet, one hand braced against the frame with more weight than he would have liked. "You are supposed to be in bed," she said. "I own the bed," he said. "I'll be in it when I decide to be in it." He looked at her. "Come in. I want to ask you something." She came in, stood near the window, didn't sit, which he noted. "The soup," he said. "You brought it every day. The nurses didn't ask you to." "No," she replied. "My mother didn't ask you to." "Definitely not." "Then why?" Hana was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone building a lie. He knew that quiet, had interrogated enough people to know the texture of it. This was different. This was someone deciding how much of a true thing to say. "My father was sick once," she said finally. "For a long time. I was very young and very far from home, and there was nothing I could do that actually helped." She looked at him steadily. "So I cooked, because it was the only thing I could control. It didn't save him." A pause. "But I don't think it hurt." Min-jun looked at her. Something shifted in his face, barely visible, the kind of change you'd miss if you weren't paying the right kind of attention. "I'm sorry," he said. "About your father." Hana blinked. It was, she realized, the last thing she had expected him to say. "Get back in bed," she said quietly. "You're leaning on that door frame harder than you think you are." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The whispers started the second week. They were careful about it. The household staff had not survived in a Park Min-jun property by being openly stupid. But walls in large houses have excellent acoustics, and Hana had spent 8 months learning which ones carried sound. "She sleeps in his wing now, every night. Did you see the way he called her by name? He doesn't call any of us by name. There's something off about her. Always has been. A maid from Africa. What does she know about how things work here? She let it pass over her. She had developed a particular skill for that, for letting contempt move through her without letting it land. It was a skill she had learned young and refined under circumstances she did not discuss. What she couldn't let pass was Madame Park. Though in her own son's house, she considered announcement an optional courtesy. She moved through the mansion with the authority of a woman who had built it, even though she hadn't, and stopped in the kitchen doorway where Hana was preparing the afternoon meal. She looked at Hana the way certain women look at things that have been placed somewhere they don't belong. "You've been spending a great deal of time with my son," she said. In Korean, deliberately. She knew Hana's Korean was still developing. Hana answered in Korean anyway. Careful, measured. "I bring his meals and assist the medical team when needed, madam." "That's not what I asked." Soo-Yun stepped into the kitchen. Her heels on the stone floor were precise, unhurried. "I asked about the time, the sitting, she paused, as if selecting the cleanest word for something dirty. "Singing, humming," Hana said. "I beg your pardon?" "It was humming, madam, not singing." The room temperature dropped 3 degrees. "You will return to your standard duties," Soo-Yun said, softly enough that it sounded almost polite. "Meals, cleaning, laundry. You will not enter my son's room unless specifically directed by the medical staff. You will not," she paused again, letting it sit, "make yourself at home in spaces that are not yours." Hana held her gaze. "Of course, madam." She didn't move from the counter. She didn't lower her eyes. Soo-Yun left. Hana released a slow breath through her nose and went back to the broth. That evening she brought it to his room anyway. The raid came on a Thursday night without the courtesy of warning. Min-Jun was in the study, his first time out of the bedroom for anything other than the corridor, sitting in the chair behind his desk with a tablet reviewing financial reports that Kang had quietly compiled, relearning the shape of an empire that had been left unguarded for nearly 2 weeks. Hana was in the hallway outside, returning from the kitchen with his evening medication, when she heard it. Not the sound itself at first, but the absence of sound, the particular silence that falls in a house when something wrong enters it. She was already moving when the first window shattered. 3 men, east entrance, moving fast and with the kind of coordination that meant this wasn't a robbery. This was a message, and the message was for a man who wasn't yet strong enough to receive it standing up. She pushed into the study. "We have to go, now." Min-Jun looked up. One glance at her face, at the absolute absence of panic in it, the clear-eyed urgency, and he was already closing the tablet. "How many?" 3 that I saw, east side. There may be more. Kang, we'll handle the east side. We go west, through the service corridor." He stood. His legs held, barely. She moved to his side without asking, and he took the support without comment, which told her better than anything how serious he understood this to be. She moved him through the corridor with a speed and surety that had nothing to do with the floor, plans she'd been given on her first day. She took the older passage, the one that predated the renovation, that wasn't on any current schematic, that she had found on her own 4 months ago, out of a habit she had cultivated long before she ever set foot in this house. They reached the basement loading bay. Cold air, low light, a delivery vehicle with keys still in the column. Min-Jun lowered himself into the passenger seat, breathing harder than he would admit. She was already behind the wheel. He looked at her. "You knew that passage?" "Yes. That passage isn't on any map I gave staff access to." "No," she agreed. She started the engine. "It isn't." He was quiet for 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds she felt it, the shift, the first thread of something pulling loose in the careful construction she had maintained for 8 months. Then he said, "Drive." She drove. They sat in the parking structure of a hotel 2 kilometers away, engine off, while Kang coordinated the sweep through Hana's phone, because it was the only one that hadn't been left behind. Min-Jun sat with his head resting against the chair, eyes closed, his face calm. He was resting. She sat beside him, quietly, not saying anything. She knew he needed peace and didn't want to fill the quiet with words. The moment felt safe, just the 2 of them, sitting together. After a while he said without opening his eyes, "You moved like someone who's done that before." "Done what?" "Evacuated someone under pressure, knowing exactly where to go, not panicking." He paused. "That's not Maid training." Hana looked at the concrete wall ahead of them. "I grew up in a city where knowing how to leave a building fast was a survival skill," she said. Not a special one, just a necessary one. He opened his eyes and looked at her. She turned and looked back at him. Whatever question was forming behind his eyes, he kept it. Filed it. She could see him doing it, storing it, the way a man stores things he intends to return to. "Thank you," he said quietly. Again, Hana nodded once. Looked away first. In the quiet of that parking structure, in the cold and the low light, she felt the thing she had been carefully, deliberately, keeping at arm's length for 8 months take one slow step closer. She did not let herself think about what that meant yet. She could not afford to. 3 weeks after the raid, Min-jun was almost himself again. There were moments when he moved too quickly, stood for too long, or when the afternoon light hit just right, that his body quietly reminded him of the things it had been through, the limits it had touched but hadn't fully recovered from. Yet, to anyone watching, to his lieutenants who slowly returned when they heard that the Black Dragon was alive, alert, and very much in control, he appeared exactly as they remembered him. Strong, unchanged, cold, precise, patient in the way that dangerous things are patient. He had spent the 3 weeks doing 2 things simultaneously: rebuilding, quietly reasserting control over the syndicate's operations, identifying who had held steady in his absence, and who had begun making private arrangements, and investigating, pulling every thread connected to the ambush, following each one to its end, mapping the shape of a betrayal he could feel, but not yet see completely. He hadn't told Hana what he was looking for. He hadn't told her what he was beginning to suspect. Hana, for her part, had her own private war running beneath the surface of every ordinary day. She had not planned for Min-jun to wake up as a person. That sounds cold, and it was, but it was the truth she had arrived in Seoul with, the truth she had maintained through 8 months of careful distance, of being invisible, of being exactly what the role required her to be. She had not planned for the CCTV footage question. She had not planned for, "I'm sorry about your father," delivered without calculation or agenda, just plain human acknowledgement from a man who had no particular reason to offer it. She had not planned for the parking structure, for the way he'd said, "Thank you," again, like the word cost him something and he was paying it anyway. She lay awake most nights now doing the arithmetic of a situation that no longer added up the way it was supposed to. The mission on one side, the man she had actually encountered on the other, the growing, terrifying gap between them. She had been sent here to finish a job. She had not finished it, and with every passing day, the window for pretending she still might was closing. It was Kang who found the thread first, not because he was looking for Hana specifically. He was pulling surveillance on a mid-level enemy operative named SEO, who had connections to the ambush, tracking his movements through the city, building the kind of patient evidence profile that Kang did better than almost anyone. It was detail work, slow and unglamorous, and it was on the 14th day of it that a name appeared in SEO's communication records that made Kang sit very still in front of his screen for a long time before he picked up the phone. He called Min-jun directly, not a message, a call. "Sir," he said, "I need you to see something." Min-jun looked at the file for a long time without speaking. Kang stood across the desk, hands folded, expression carefully neutral in the way of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. The file was thin, but it was enough. A name, Hana Diallo, appearing in SEO's records 8 months ago. A transfer of funds to an account traceable, with effort, back to a shell company controlled by Chairman Park Dae-hyun. A communication log, nothing explicit, nothing that would survive a courtroom, but readable to anyone who knew how to read it, that described the placement of an asset in the Park Min-jun household. An asset. Min-jun closed the file. "Where is she now?" he said. "Kitchen," Kang said, "preparing dinner." Min-jun was quiet for a moment. Then, "Bring SEO in, tonight. I want to speak with him directly." Kang nodded and left without another word. Min-jun sat alone in the study for a long time after that, looking at nothing, the file closed on the desk in front of him, the room very still. He thought about night 7. He thought about her hands around his. He thought about, "You are not allowed to leave yet." Words he hadn't heard directly but had reconstructed from the nurse's account, from the physician's account, from the way the room had looked when he finally opened his eyes and found her still there. He thought about the parking structure, about it isn't. The way she'd said it without flinching, without offering more than she was ready to offer. He thought about the gap between what the files said she was and what every instinct he possessed told him about who she actually was. The two things didn't fit together. He needed them to fit before he did anything. They brought SEO in at midnight, basement level, a room that had a drain in the floor and no windows, the kind of room whose purpose announced itself without explanation. SEO was a practical man. He understood, within about 4 minutes of the conversation beginning, that the particular configuration of his evening, the room, the drain, the man sitting across from him with the absolute stillness of someone who had already decided how far he was willing to go, meant that the calculus of loyalty had shifted significantly in favor of honesty. He talked, and what he said landed in the room like something thrown from a great height. "She was placed by your uncle," CO said. His voice was careful, stripped of everything except the facts he'd decided were safer to give than to keep. 8 months ago, the original plan was the ambush, but your uncle wanted a contingency, something inside the house, someone who could finish it quietly if you survived the road. He swallowed. The African girl, she was the contingency. Minjun said nothing. It was supposed to look like a complication from the injuries, something the doctors couldn't pin down. SEO glanced at Kang but found no answers there. She turned her gaze back. "But she didn't do it. We waited. Weeks went by, she never did. So the raid was partly to pressure her, a reminder that the job wasn't finished. And my mother," Minjun said, quietly, the way very dangerous things are quiet. "Was she aware of the contingency?" SEO hesitated 1 second too long. "Was she aware?" Minjun said again, the same tone, which somehow made it worse. "She suggested it." CO said. The room was very still after that. He dismissed Kang. He sat alone in the basement room for 17 minutes. He noted the time without meaning to, the way his mind continued, cataloging, even when the rest of him was somewhere else entirely. His mother, the woman who had stood in the doorway of his hospital room for 40 seconds and left, who had begun dividing his empire before his body was cold, who had sat across from him at dinner tables for 34 years, with a face he had never once successfully read, and apparently never needed to, because the thing behind it had been this, had always at some level been this, and Hana, placed, paid, sent into his house as a weapon, wearing the face of a woman who brought soup at 5 a.m. and told him he wasn't allowed to leave yet and held his hands through a storm when everyone else had already let go. He pressed the heel of his hand against the desk and breathed. The two things still didn't fit, the file and the woman, the mission and the 7 nights, the asset and the person who had looked at him in a parking structure in the cold and looked away first, not out of guilt, he realized now, but out of something that frightened her more than guilt. They didn't fit, but they were both true, and he didn't know what to do with a truth that broke in 2 different directions at once. He found her in the kitchen, late, past 11, the rest of the household down. She was at the counter with her back to the door, cleaning up the last of the evening, moving through the familiar rhythm of it with the particular efficiency of someone who has done a task so many times it has become almost meditative. She heard him come in. He could tell by the slight pause in her movement, almost imperceptible, the kind of tell only someone paying very close attention would catch. She turned. One look at his face and she knew. He could see the exact moment she knew. Something in her eyes shifting, not to panic, not to the performance of innocence, to something quieter and more devastating than either of those things, to the specific expression of someone who has been dreading a moment for so long that when it finally arrives, it almost feels like relief. "Minjun." "Don't," he said, not loudly, not yet. He walked to the other side of the counter, put distance between them that felt necessary in a way he couldn't fully articulate, then looked at her across it. "Tell me," he said, "not SEO's version, yours." Hana set down what was in her hands. She was quiet for a moment. That particular quiet he had catalogued and misread and now understood differently, the quiet of someone deciding how much of a true thing to say. Except this time, she was deciding to say all of it. "I was recruited 2 years ago," she said, "by people who told me your uncle's network was responsible for what happened to my family. That your family, the whole operation, had ties to a trafficking syndicate that moved through West Africa. That people like my brother," she stopped, started again. "That people I loved had been destroyed by money that moved through your organization." She looked at him steadily. "They weren't wrong about that part. I checked, multiple times. I checked. So you came here to kill me." "I came here to complete a mission," she said. "Which, yes, was to ensure you didn't survive the injuries." Her voice didn't shake. She seemed to have made a decision about that, about not letting it shake. "I had 8 months to do it. The access, the opportunity. I had every—" She stopped again, breathed. "I didn't do it." "I know you didn't," he said. "I want to know why." She looked at him for a long time. Across the counter, across the space he had put between them, across the 8 months of a constructed proximity that had somehow, against every calculation either of them had made, become something real. "Because you were in pain," she said simply. "And the pain was real, and I sat with it long enough to understand that you were not what they told me you were." There was a pause. "Or, not only that, not in the ways that mattered to me." She held his gaze. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know what I came here to do. I'm not asking you to—" "Hana, stop." "My mother," he said. Hana stopped. "Was she involved in what happened to your family, your brother?" Something crossed her face, complicated, layered. "The money that funded the network that took him, yes, it traces back to your uncle's operation, and your mother knew about the operation. I believe she knew what it was used for." Minjun turned away from her, stood with his back to the room, facing the dark window, the city lights beyond it blurred by the rain that had started falling an hour ago. His mother, his uncle, the empire he had bled for, the foundation of it rotting in ways he had chosen, he could admit now, not to look at too closely. He stood at the window for a long time. When he turned back, Hana hadn't moved. She was still standing at the counter, watching him, waiting for whatever came next with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided to stop running from the thing they're afraid of. "You should leave," he said. "Tonight, I'll have Kang arrange." "I'm not leaving." He looked at her. "Not yet," she said quietly. "I have something, evidence, financial records, communication logs, things I compiled over 8 months, against your uncle, against the network." She held his eyes. "I didn't come here only to end your life, Minjun. I came here for justice, for my brother, for everyone the network destroyed." There was a pause. "I still want that, and I think you want it now too." The rain against the window, the kitchen quiet around them, the distance between them that was no longer quite the same distance it had been 5 minutes ago. He looked at her for a long moment. "Show me the evidence," he said finally. Hana nodded. Once, neither of them moved yet, standing on opposite sides of a counter in a kitchen at midnight, in the wreckage of a constructed thing that had somehow built itself into something neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them knew how to name. Outside, Soul drowned quietly in the rain. The evidence was in a drive the size of a thumb, taped to the underside of a drawer in the laundry room, the one room in the mansion that nobody with any real power ever entered. 8 months of work. Patient, invisible, the kind of documentation that only someone with unlimited access and zero suspicion attached to their name could have assembled. Financial transfer records pulled from documents she had no business seeing and had seen anyway. Communication logs she had copied during the 3 weeks Min-Jun lay unconscious, when his uncle had briefly treated the mansion like a property already transferred to new ownership and had grown careless with what he discussed and where. Photographs, account numbers, a chain of evidence that connected Chairman Park Dae-hyun's shell companies directly to a trafficking network operating across 4 countries. Min-Jun sat with it for 2 hours. Hana sat across from him and let him read. She answered questions when he had them and didn't fill the silence when he didn't. By the time he closed the drive and set it on the table between them, something in his face had settled into a coldness she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled blankness he wore as default armor, but something underneath that, something that had been building since the basement room and had now found its shape. "This is enough," he said. "For prosecution? For everything." He looked at her. "You've been building a case." "Yes, for 2 years. Yes, for a brother." Hana was quiet for a moment. "His name was Kofi," she said. "He was 19. Min-Jun looked at her with the full weight of his attention, the kind of attention that had made boardrooms uncomfortable and enemies reconsider. He wasn't using it as a weapon now. He was just looking. How old were you when you lost him? 24, she said. Old enough to know what had happened. Young enough to be stupid about what I was willing to do about it. Coming here wasn't stupid, he said. It was dangerous and it was built on a lie, but it wasn't stupid. He paused. You're the most competent person who has ever worked in this house, including people I pay significantly more than a maid's salary. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, the ghost of one, gone before it fully arrived. What happens now? She said. Now, Min-jun said, we end it. He moved fast in the way that he had always moved when the decision was finally made, with a completeness that left no room for second positions. Within 48 hours he had contacted 2 people outside the syndicate, a prosecutor he had maintained leverage over for 3 years, who was, it turned out, genuinely relieved to have a reason to do something righteous, and an investigative journalist whose reputation was built on exactly the kind of story the drive contained. He did not tell his mother what was coming. He did not tell his uncle. He told Kang to increase the household security without explanation, and Kang, 6 years of reading this man's silences, increased it without asking. What Min-jun didn't account for was how fast Dae-hyun moved when he felt the walls beginning to close. The call came from an unknown number at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Hana was awake. She had been sleeping poorly for 2 weeks, lying in the dark running the same arithmetic over and over, the mission and the man and the increasingly complicated territory between them. She answered because unknown numbers at 6 a.m. were the kind of thing she had trained herself not to ignore. The voice on the other end was one she recognized, a fixer, someone peripheral to Dae-hyun's network, whom she had encountered briefly during the recruitment process 2 years ago. The chairman knows you flipped, the voice said. No preamble. He's moving today. Whatever you think is in place, it isn't ready yet. He has a team going to the mansion in 4 hours. The line went dead. She was in Min-jun's study in 3 minutes. He was already awake, sitting behind the desk, speaking to Kang on the phone. Another call had come in, same story, different source. When she walked in, he looked up, noticing she was dressed and alert. His face shifted slightly, just enough to show that he'd acknowledged her presence, nothing more, nothing less. I know, he said. 4 hours? 3 now, she said. The source I spoke to was a few minutes ahead of yours. He looked at her. How do you have a source inside Dae-hyun's network? I have several, she said. I've been cultivating them for 8 months. There was a pause. I told you I came here for justice. I meant it. Another of those long looks, the one she had stopped trying to deflect. We move the evidence first, he said. Physical copies out of the house. Then we deal with the rest. They had 2 hours before it went wrong. The physical copies were out. The prosecutor had been contacted. The journalist had the digital files on a secured server. The pieces were in motion. And if Min-jun and Kang and the security team could hold the line for another 6 hours, the story would break publicly, and Dae-hyun would find himself in the specific trap of a man whose crimes were no longer private enough to bury. The team arrived early, not 4 hours, not 3, 90 minutes, which meant someone inside the household had made a call, and the miscalculation of who could be trusted had just become very expensive. They came through 3 entry points simultaneously. Professional, coordinated, the kind of operation that had been planned for longer than 4 hours. This wasn't a panic response, this was a contingency that had been sitting ready, waiting for the signal. Kang's team held the east and north. The west entrance was more complicated. Min-jun and Hana were in the corridor outside the study when the west door came in. 2 men, moving fast. The first one Kang's team would reach in seconds. Hana could hear them coming. The second one had a direct line to Min-jun, and the distance was wrong, the angle was wrong, and Min-jun was still 3 weeks from full strength, and she did the calculation in the fraction of a second available to her, and the calculation had one answer. She moved in front of him. The shot was meant for center mass. It caught her high on the left side, shoulder, the edge of the chest wall, and the impact sat her down hard against the corridor wall with a force that knocked the breath from her completely. She heard Min-jun's voice say her name, her actual name, not Hana C, not the careful professional distance of it, just Hana, stripped and immediate. And then Kang's team was there and the corridor was controlled, and she was aware of Min-jun's hands on her face, tilting it up, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on it before. Raw, unmanaged, the face of a man who has just watched something happen that he cannot file away or process later or manage from behind glass. "Look at me," he said. His voice was steady in the way of someone forcing it to be steady through an effort that cost him. "Hana, look at me." She looked at him. The pain was significant, but she had been trained for pain, and the wound wasn't where it would be fatal, and she knew the difference. "I'm all right," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "It's not. I'm all right." "You stepped in front of it," he said. "Yes, you stepped in front of it. Min-jun, I'm all right. I need you to focus." He looked at her for one more second, something in his face doing something she didn't have words for yet. And then he looked up at Kang, and the focused, operational version of him reassembled with a visible act of will. But his hand stayed on her face for 3 more seconds before he let go. She noticed a difference. The hospital, a different room from the one he had occupied, smaller, brighter, smelling of antiseptic rather than the expensive neutrality of his mansion's medical wing. She drifted in and out for the first few hours, which she resented. There were things she wanted to be awake for. The surgery was clean, the surgeon said. The bullet had not done what bullets in that location could do, and the trajectory had been slightly more merciful than it had any right to be. She would recover fully. It would take time. She was to rest. She was aware, at some point in the early afternoon, of Min-jun in the chair beside the bed, not pacing, not on the phone, not managing the crisis that was, she would later learn, unfolding exactly as planned in every direction outside this room. Just sitting, in the chair, the same chair she had occupied for 7 nights in a different room in a different crisis, on the other side of the equation. He noticed she was awake. He didn't immediately speak. He looked at her the way she had looked at him, just making sure, just checking that the fact of her continued existence was real and not something his mind had assembled for its own comfort. "The prosecutor moved this morning," he said finally. "The files are public. Dae-hyun was detained 2 hours ago." Hana absorbed this. "Your mother?" A pause. The longest one he'd given any question in all the months she'd known him. "She turned herself in," he said. "An hour after Dae-hyun was taken." His voice was even. Completely, carefully even, in the way of a man who has done the work of a very difficult feeling in private and is now presenting only its aftermath. Her lawyer called it a cooperative arrangement. She had documentation implicating Dae-hyun in the ambush in exchange for reduced charges. He looked at the window. She protected herself, efficiently, he stopped, which is exactly who she is. Hana watched him. "Min-jun," he looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your mother. Whatever she is still your mother, and I know that this—" "Don't apologize for the truth," he said quietly. "You told me who she was. The evidence told me who she was. I chose for 34 years not to look." A pause. "That's mine to carry, not yours." The room was quiet. Afternoon light through the window. Somewhere outside Seoul was continuing its business, traffic and commerce, and the 1,000 ordinary transactions of a city that didn't know or care that something had just ended and something else, unclear in its shape, was beginning. "Kofi," she said quietly. Min-jun looked at her. "My brother," she said. "The network that took him. Dae-hyun's arrest will pull the thread on it. The prosecutor knows. It's in the files." She paused. "He won't come back, I know that. But the people responsible—" "Will be held," Min-jun said. "I'll make sure of it personally." He held her gaze. "Not as a favor, but as a debt. My family's operation funded what happened to him. That's a debt." Hana looked at him for a long time. Then, for the first time in 8 months, through everything that had accumulated between them like weather, she let herself cry. Not dramatically, quietly, the way she did everything, just her eyes filling and the tears coming before she had made any decision about whether to allow them. Min-jun didn't say anything. He didn't reach for platitudes or the careful language of comfort. He reached over and took her hand. The way she had taken his once, in a different hospital room, in a different storm. He held it until she was done. 1 year later, Park Min-jun still couldn't sleep during storms. He didn't tell anyone that. It wasn't the kind of thing the Black Dragon announced, But on nights when the rain came down hard enough to make Seoul sound temporary, he would wake at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., with his chest tight and his mind already running, back to a narrow road in Mapo district, back to 37 bullets, back to the particular darkness of a place between living and not living that he couldn't fully describe because there were no words for it that didn't sound like something a man invented after the fact, to make sense of something that made none. He would lie there for a while, and then almost always he would hear it, soft, low, coming from somewhere else in the house, the kitchen, the garden, occasionally the corridor outside his room when she thought he was asleep and she was restless too, humming the same song, the one she had sung in his room for 7 nights when he was too far gone to respond, and she had decided that didn't matter. Her grandmother's song. She had told him that once, quietly, not making a story of it, just a fact offered because he had asked. On those nights he would get up, follow the sound and find her. And they would sit together, in the kitchen, in the garden, wherever the sound had led him, without making a production of it. 2 people who had each, in their own way, seen the underside of the world, sitting together in the dark, because the dark was easier with company. That was the thing nobody would have written in a story about the Black Dragon. That he had become, in the quiet hours, simply a man who followed the sound of someone humming, because it was the sound that had pulled him back from the edge of gone. The night everything changed for the second time, it was raining again. Seoul had a sense of drama. They were in the main hall, Hana at the far end, dressed for an event they had just returned from, still in the long dark dress that had made 3 of his former associates forget what they were saying mid-sentence, which he had noted and filed with a private satisfaction he hadn't examined too closely. She had her back to him, taking off her earrings, and he was watching her with the particular attention of a man who still, 12 months in, caught himself looking. He had something in his jacket pocket that had been there for 3 weeks. He had been waiting, not because he was uncertain. He had not been uncertain since the moment in the garden when she said she wanted to stay and he said yes before she finished asking. He had been waiting for the right moment in the specific way that men who are not good with softness wait for moments, hoping the moment will announce itself clearly enough that they don't have to manufacture it. Hana, she turned, earring in hand, looked at him across the length of the hall. He walked toward her, stopped when there was barely a foot between them, close enough that she tilted her head slightly to hold his eyes, the way she always did, never once looking away first anymore. That had changed somewhere in the last year. The looking away first, she had stopped doing it, and he had never pointed it out, because pointing it out would have made it smaller than it was. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said, watching him with those patient eyes that had learned him the way water learns stone, slowly, completely, without making a fuss about it. "The night you stayed," he said, "night 7, I know you think I couldn't hear you." He held her gaze. "I couldn't, not consciously. But I've thought about what the nurse told me afterward, what the physician said, what you said to a man you had no medical reason to believe could receive it." He paused. "You told me I wasn't allowed to leave yet." Hana was very still. "You were right," he said. "I wasn't finished. I had—" He stopped, pressed through it. "I had you to find. I just didn't know it yet. And somehow you knew it for both of us, which is—" The corner of his mouth moved. "Honestly, very typical of you." She made a sound that was half breath, half something that wanted to be a laugh and couldn't quite get there. He reached into his jacket pocket, brought out a ring, simple, not ostentatious, the kind of thing he had spent an embarrassing amount of time selecting because everything too large felt like performance, and this was not a performance. This was the realest thing he had done in 35 years of living. He did not go to one knee. That wasn't who he was, and she would have found it strange. He stood in front of her, eye level, and held it out in his open palm the way you offer something to someone and let them choose. "I'm not the man I was when you came here," he said quietly. "I'm aware that's partly your fault. I'm choosing to consider it a positive." He looked at her. "Stay, not for a while. Stay." Hana looked at the ring in his palm, then at his face, then at the ring again. "You practiced that," she said. "Extensively," he said. She laughed. A real one this time, sudden and unguarded, the laugh she only had when something caught her completely off guard. and he loved it with a specificity that still surprised him sometimes. How particular love turned out to be. How it attached itself not to the grand gestures but to the exact sound of one specific person laughing when they hadn't planned to. She took the ring from his palm, put it on her own finger and looked up at him. "I already stayed," she said. "I stayed on night 1. She held his gaze. "It just took me a while to admit it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled her in. Not dramatically, not with the sweeping production of a man performing a romantic moment. Just close, the way you hold something real. Outside, Seoul rain hammered the windows. Neither of them flinched. Neither. Months later, Kang placed a file on Minjun's desk without a word and left the room. Minjun opened it. Inside were surveillance photographs. A new organization, moving quietly through the gaps left by Dae-hyun's collapsed network, operating across Seoul and Busan, with a structure that was familiar enough to suggest someone who had studied the old syndicate from the inside, someone who knew exactly how the Black Dragon had operated, someone who had been waiting patiently for him to step away. At the bottom of the file was a single photograph, a man Minjun didn't recognize, mid-40s, unremarkable face, the kind of person they forgot immediately after seeing him. Handwritten on the back of the photograph in Kang's precise script, "He's been asking about her." Minjun closed the file, sat back. Outside his office window, through the open door down the hall, he could hear it, faint, unhurried, moving through the house like it belonged there. Hana, humming. He picked up the file again. The Black Dragon, it turned out, was not done after all.